It was 3 years ago today that I started filming my first YouTube video for this channel. Funnily enough, it wasn't a chopping board. Let's fix that. I've made quite a few chopping boards in the years that I've been woodworking. In fact, I think the first thing I probably ever made was a chopping board, but I've never felt the need to film myself making one for the channel until now, and that's because I think this bit of wood is pretty cool, but we'll get to that in a minute. You can see here that this board's got a pretty savage cup to it, and I've got an idea to reduce the amount of thickness that I'm going to lose when planing this board. But to do that, I'm going to need to rip this board right down the middle, and the safest way I can think to rip a board that's this cupped is to use my jigsaw. Here you can see just how cupped this piece of wood actually is. The grey areas top and bottom show how much material the planer needs to remove in order to get a flat surface. That's a lot of thickness gone. Now if we rip the board down the middle first, each narrower piece has a much shallower cup, so the planer only needs to remove a fraction of that material. And here's the comparison. The red shows the final thickness if we hadn't ripped the board, and the green shows the thickness we achieved by ripping first. You can clearly see how much more material we've been able to keep. And as a bonus, ripping the board down the middle gives us the opportunity to insert a contrasting strip of a different species, turning what was a necessary cut into something a lot more interesting. But more on that later. This is going to take a while. I'll come back when it's done. It was around the 5-minute mark that I regretted my decision to start using the jigsaw for this, but I persevered and we got through it. Now that I've got the board cut in half, I think I can safely run it through the bandsaw to get rid of these live edge sides. So I'm just going to reference this straight edge I cut with a jigsaw for each and cut these down to not final size but near on. Using the bandsaw to make these cuts was an absolute joy after spending 15 minutes with the jigsaw making that rip cut. But I didn't want to run the risk of the bandsaw blade binding if there was any tension stored in this wood. Safety first. You can see here just how much shallower that cup is on each of the boards after I've cut them in half, so we're going to have so much less wastage after I finish milling these boards down, which is great because this piece of wood was actually pretty expensive. So earlier on I said that I think this piece of wood is pretty cool, but how can a piece of wood that's so cupped and bowed be cool? I was up at my local lumber mill just having a look around when I found this piece of wood, and I got chatting to someone who worked there and just happened to ask if they knew whereabouts this tree actually came from. Here. Well, obviously it's not here anymore. This is about 3 miles from where I currently live, and I just love the idea of making something out of a tree that I would have gone past so many times while it was still growing. That's why I think this is cool. So I've been playing around with a couple of different bits of wood to make the stripe in this board. So I've got a nice piece of flame maple here, really thin, but I don't really like the proportions of the board. I'd have to chop it down a bit smaller for it to look alright, and I don't really want to make it any smaller. I've also got this piece of sycamore that I just surfaced, and I really like how that looks, so I think I'm going to go with that. So you saw me go through my standard milling process using my benchtop surface planer and my thickness planer. I'm now using the table saw to clean up the final side of each piece and rip them down to the same width. And as I'm at the table saw, I'm just going to cut down that contrasting sycamore strip. I'm really happy with how this board's coming out so far. Next job is to get some glue in it, get it in clamps and leave that glue to cure. Looking back with hindsight, I kind of wish I'd used biscuits on this board, not to add any strength as I'm sure you've heard a million times before, but just to keep everything nice and aligned. The glue up didn't go as planned and it was a bit uneven, meaning when I come to thicknesses I have to take a bit more material off than I originally wanted to. I left the board in clamps overnight. The glue would have definitely cured by now, so let's get those clamps off and then get this board down to final thickness. I really didn't need to leave the board in clamps overnight, but this was mid-heat wave and it was ridiculously humid, so I wanted to give the glue as much time as possible to cure before I run it through the planer to get it down to final thickness. Which only took a few passes, so I did retain as much thickness as I possibly could, which was the original plan with ripping the board down in the first place. I decided to go with my Mitre saw to cut the board down to final size. I wanted to keep the board dimensions as big as possible, so I'm sneaking up on the cut, taking a tiny amount off each time. I did plan to make this cut on my table saw originally, but it didn't have enough infeed capacity, but thankfully the Mitre saw had just enough cut capacity to make it through the whole board. I've got a 3mm or 1/8 inch round over bit in the router table just to soften the edges of the board. I'm doing what's called a climb cut here, which is where you feed the workpiece through the router the same way as the bit's spinning. It helps prevent nasty tear out, especially when routing end grain. Now we're done with the routing, you can see there's these tiny little knot holes on the edge and on the face. So what I'm going to do is try and fill them with a bit of black CA glue. I'd normally use a toothpick for this, but I don't have a toothpick. So I'm going to use this little pin nail and hope that that's small enough to get it deep inside the crack. Don't laugh. After I finished filling all the cracks and knot holes with the CA glue, I began sanding, starting at 120 grit, just to remove any marks left over from thickness planer. And as always, hand sanding all the edges. This also removed all the excess CA glue. I've got some locally sourced beeswax and some mineral oil here that I use to make a finish for my chopping boards. I use about a 3-to-1 mix of the mineral oil to the beeswax. I put it into an old slow cooker, melt it together and get this really nice finishing wax that protects and makes your chopping board look great. I've sanded up through the grits to 180 and it is now time to water pop this board, which basically involves spraying the board down with a little bit of water. This raises the grain and allows me to sand it down smooth again because the water makes it feel quite rough. As this is a chopping board and it's going to come into contact with water, if I don't do this now, the first time I use it and then clean it off, it's going to feel really rough and horrible to touch. So get it done now, sand it back smooth again, and then move on to the next steps. After the board dried off, which didn't actually take that long because, as I said before, heat wave, I sanded to 180 again, finishing off the edges by hand, and then started rubbing in some mineral oil to the board. This is my favourite part. You can really see all the character in the board come out here in that grain. It just looks absolutely incredible. I kept adding coats of mineral oil until the board stopped absorbing it, wiped off any excess, and then moved on to apply a coat of that oil beeswax mix that we made earlier in the video. This adds an amazing sheen to the board and a layer of protection from any moisture the board will come into contact with. Just make sure to wipe off any excess wax from the board once you're done. So there we have it. A brand new chopping board made out of locally sourced materials. I think it looks amazing. I'm really excited to use this. The beeswax finish has just made that walnut grain pop. I'll put some B-roll clips in now for you to see it up close, but I couldn't be happier with the result. And it was a really simple project that only took a couple of days. Is it the most fancy, exciting, crazy chopping board ever made? No, no way, but it's just what I need. If you're still here, thanks for sticking about and watching the video. If you like stuff like this, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and I'll catch you again in the next one.